One in three women globally will experience some form of physical, psychological, or sexual violence in their lives. And it's about one in four men. That data is specifically for the US. Any other workplace environment. If we see something happening in a dance environment and we ask ourselves, would that happen? Or what would happen if this was a school, a university, a workplace? Would
Yeah.
that behavior be acceptable?
Dabney Evans is an associate professor at Emory University in the US, and her research focuses on gender based violence. She uses survivor centered design to develop programs that prevent and respond to intimate and interpersonal violence. Dabney is also an avid social dancer with a splash of bachata in there every now and then, and has a decade of experience in capoeira as well. Dabney, I'm really excited to welcome you to Empowered Dancers.
Thank you so much for having me, Bobby. I'm really delighted to be here.
Delighted to have you with us as well. So, Dabney, what sparked that shift from capoeira to salsa for you?
Yeah, people always ask this question about capoeira. Sometimes they ask me because people come across and they realize that I know how to speak Portuguese. And they ask, how did you learn how to speak Portuguese? And I share that it's because I did capoeira for about 10 years. So I started doing capoeira just for physical activity. And capoeira is a game, and it's also a dance. It combines martial arts with acrobatics and dance movement. And I've always been a physically active person. So I really fell in love with it. And one of the things about capoeira is that there is singing, and the singing is in Portuguese. And I really wanted to understand what they were saying because there's a lot of double entendres and innuendos and actually sort of commentary about the game.
Hmm.
And so I taught myself Portuguese for that reason. And but capoeira also was something that appealed to me from a sort of values-based perspective. So capoeira began and was created by people that were enslaved and brought from Africa to Brazil. So it's one of the Afro-Latino dances that came from the diaspora, the African diaspora. And one of its core values has to do with freedom and freedom from oppression. So actually, the movement that is a part of capoeira was actually training that enslaved people were doing to plan for their escape from their enslavement. And so it's a very inclusive sport. There are songs that talk about how capoeira is for everyone, for women, for men, for children. And it includes dance movement, but it also includes some martial arts movements, as I mentioned. And I really appreciated the inclusive aspect of it, that it was sort of grounded in this history that was about a struggle and a freedom for liberation and freedom from oppression. And so that really resonates with me.
Wow, that is beautiful. And it's that self expression, I'm guessing, then that linked you in with salsa as well, because that again is a very expressive communicative dance at its origin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with all of these art forms that come from an African base or an Afro-Latino base, like capoeira and like salsa, there's something really human and rooted in all of us.
Mm.
And we connect to that often through the rhythms. These rhythms are very ancient and historical. And, if you really are like feeling the music, then I believe that that's sort of what we're tapping into. So I did capoeira for about 10 years, and then I had a child, and I sort of, went into maternal time. And so
Mm.
I took a break from capoeira and then sort of evolved and touched base with bachata first after
Okay.
a trip that I took after the COVID period. And then I decided that I wanted to take bachata and salsa classes. And I do really appreciate bachata, but I feel personally a little bit more connected to salsa music. So that's what I tend to dance more.
Nice. So, as many beautiful parts as there are within the salsa, bachata, and indeed capoeira scenes as well, we see a lot of gender-based violence. We see bad behavior. We see gender-based silencing that affects, well, it affects everyone in the scene, but it affects some more negatively than others. This is your area of expertise, Dabney. So, could you start us off by telling us what is gender-based violence?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to understand what gender-based violence is because it can be inclusive of many kinds of behaviors and experiences that occur over the life course. So, to define gender-based violence, I usually like to draw upon a definition that comes from the World Health Organization. So, that's an international organization that all countries in the world are part of, so we can kind
Hmm.
of all be speaking the same language. And the way that they define it is any action that is likely to result in physical, sexual, or mental harm or suffering to women or girls, including threats or acts such as coercion or arbitrary deprivation of liberty, and whether they occur in public or private life. To put it a little bit more plainly, I think about this as sort of physical, sexual, or psychological violence that can happen. And really, anyone can have these experiences, whether they are a woman or a girl or a man or a boy, or whether they identify as non-binary or in some other way. But
Hmm.
that experience is grounded and based upon their gender identity. So that's really the key feature of it is that these are forms of violence
Hmm.
happen because of the way that people identify their gender. And so we can think of all kinds of experiences, things from elder abuse to domestic or intimate partner violence to sexual exploitation of children or childhood sexual abuse. So there's really a wide spectrum that can happen
Hmm.
across the lifespan and lots of different kinds of experiences that people have.
Okay. So when you're looking at the violence, the abuse, the misconduct that we're seeing in the SBK scene, would you classify that largely as gender-based violence?
I would consider it a form or a type of gender-based
Yeah.
violence. And in my opinion, what we see mostly within the community is sexual violence or sexual harassment, which is also a form of gender-based violence,
Hmm.
as well as what looks a lot like intimate partner violence. It may not necessarily be an intimate or a dating relationship, but we can sort of see a spectrum. So if you think about sexual harassment, which would be unwanted attention, ranging into things like sexual assault or rape. But then we can also see some of the dynamics that take place within intimate partner relationships, because a lot of times within our community, we have very close relationships with our teachers and with other members of our community that can sort of mimic the relationships of intimate partner or dating relationships, even if that's not what the relationship is, or it might evolve into that because of pressure and harassment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think most of us can relate to that relationship that is more than it actually is feeling. Like we've all had that feeling where, you're in dancing and you feel like, wow, I like everyone, everyone's my friend because there's all of this positive energy, there's physical touch. And then maybe you don't go dancing for a couple of weeks and you realize, hey, I don't contact most of these people. It's almost an illusion that gets created because of the circumstance in which we are.
Yeah, and I can share from my personal experience. I had some experiences in capoeira where I was very intensely training. When I started doing capoeira, I was training once a week, twice a week, three times a week. Then every day we were
Yeah.
doing performances. I was traveling. And after class, we would go and get smoothies together or go and share meals together. And one of the things that happens is that becomes your social circle, that becomes your
Yeah.
group of friends. And then if something happens within that community that crosses a boundary, then you feel like not only have you lost this activity that you love, but you've also lost all of your social network. And
Yeah.
especially when it's something that may be, sort of a betrayal or a crossing of boundaries or something inappropriate or harmful, then you really feel like, were these people ever my friends? Who are my
Hmm.
friends? And then those also around us are put in a very difficult situation as well, where they also are part of this community, which is a large part of their identity that takes
Hmm.
up a lot of their time and their money and their resources and their all of their energy, and they also don't want to lose that thing even if there may be harm taking place. So I think most of us understand that from the amount of time and energy that we put into dancing and the love that we have for it. And then when these harms happen, it can really be devastating personally and also within our sort of social networks.
Yeah. It's quite a indescribable feeling when you end up in a position where, as you're saying, that social network, rather than you choosing to leave it, which is normally what happens when you lose or leave a community, but actually someone else has taken that away from you. It's
It's
an
a huge,
incredible sense of loss.
it is. It's a huge loss. And really, I think when we think about people that have been victimized or that have experienced sexual assault or sexual harassment, and I prefer to use the word survivor,
Hmm.
but some people use the word victim, so either of those terms, may
Yeah.
apply. Um, but there's really a grieving process that people have to go through. And this
Yeah.
is combined with, some of the confusion that can happen when experiences of violence occur, gaslighting and self-doubt and stigma and shame that leads to people not disclosing or sharing their experiences. So these can be very psychologically overwhelming experiences for people as they try to navigate, this thing that they love, which is the dance, even
Hmm.
individual people that they love or care about as their friends, and then whatever harm they've experienced and how to sort of make sense of that and look for a way forward.
So when we look at those factors that lead to gender-based violence, what are the risk factors that we're talking about here?
So, I think we can think about risk factors in a couple of different ways.
Okay.
There's a model that's called the socio-ecological model, which, if you can envision sort of like those Russian nesting dolls.
Oh, yeah, I had one when I was little.
Yeah. So think of like circles within one another.
Yeah.
And the innermost circle is going to be the individual. Now, that doesn't mean that a person is to blame if they experience any form of gender-based violence. They certainly are not.
Hmm.
They are not to blame for that. But we know is that there are some risk factors that people may experience. So, gender identity being the biggest one if we're talking about gender-based violence. So, being a woman or being a girl or being a non-binary person or a gender non-conforming person or an LGBTQ person can make you more vulnerable or more likely to experience gender-based violence. This is also true of people that identify as racial and ethnic minorities. That is an additional risk. And then when we think about the intersections of those identities, right? Racial identity together with a gender identity or an identity in a sexual or gender minority, those sort of intersections really amplify that risk and
Hmm.
can really disadvantage people and position them just based on their identities. Nothing about them as a person, but just things outside of their control that make
Yeah.
them more vulnerable. And then one of the big risk factors at the individual level is having had prior experiences of trauma, abuse, or violence. So, people experience childhood abuse and neglect. They may experience inappropriate childhood sexual abuse during their childhoods or other traumatic events during their childhoods, experiences of teen dating violence and sexual assault. So, any prior experiences of trauma also make individual people more vulnerable to future abuses.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
that's sort of at the individual level. And when we think about risk, there are also risk factors not only for having these experiences, but also for perpetrating these experiences.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Who's most likely to perpetrate these kinds of abuses? Well, it's sort of the flip side of the coin, right? So if you have a lot of privileged identities, particularly if you identify as a man or a boy, those are individuals who are more likely to perpetrate abusive behaviors. And that sort of takes us out to the beginning of the outer layers of the circle.
Mm-hmm.
So we can think about the individual experiences that people that perpetrate harm, maybe they themselves experienced abuse. So they may have also been victimized.
Mm.
They may have witnessed abusive behaviors, for example, between their parents. They may have witnessed violence. So those are the kinds of risk factors that really, on either side of the coin, they're the same. right? The same factors that set one up for being victimized or abused are the same factors that set one up to perpetrate. But the difference is the gender identity. And that sort of leads to those outer circles where we begin to think about interpersonal factors. We also think about sort of community factors, and we think of more structural factors. So here we get into the deeper waters of things like patriarchy, where we're all swimming in this sea of patriarchal norms, which are like ideas about how men and women and femininity and masculinity and everything in between in the spectrum, who's supposed to do what and how they're supposed to behave. And
Yeah.
all of those sort of layers of the nesting doll all come together within these interactions between people. And that's how they sort of come to the fore.
Yeah. So it's a whole, as you say, it's layer upon layer upon layer. So out of the structure, we have patriarchy. Coming in a section, we have community, and in again, you mentioned interpersonal situations. What can you give us an example of an interpersonal situation that is a risk factor?
Yeah. So, for example, when you have two people in a relationship or in, relationship with one another, we all have had those kinds of experiences where you meet someone and you sort of click or you
Mm.
have a chemistry, right?
Yeah.
We call that chemistry. But a lot of that actually, and there may be some, sort of, pheromone level of that or whatever else. Um, but we also bring with us our past experiences. So oftentimes people that have past experiences of trauma and abuse, they know that experience and they sort of can, even at a subconscious level, know and identify that in others. And so
Hmm.
sometimes those people connect to one another. And that is when those dynamics can come together and replicate those harmful experiences of the past. So
Right.
it's sort of like people can, again, not putting responsibility on anyone that experiences harm, but that there are some like kind of triggering factors that can come into play
Yeah.
based on prior traumas. And so how those things come into the dynamics of a relationship and whether that relationship is a healthy relationship or an unhealthy relationship, you know?
Mm.
So we can think about the way in which trauma sort of lives in the body. So when we think about this in the context of dance, I had a shoulder injury some years ago, and
Yeah.
so I'm very sensitive about my right shoulder. And when I started doing dance, hammer locks really freaked me out a lot
Yeah.
because I just felt like, oh, this is uncomfortable for me. And when I was first beginning to dance, I would hear a lot of times people saying, you just need to relax. You just need to relax.
Oh, I hate that sentence so much.
Right.
Oh, thank you. I'm relaxed now. Didn't know I
Yeah,
needed
I'm
that.
really, well, I mean, we can have a whole different conversation about that because
Yeah.
many follows identify as women. And I think as women, there are very few times in our lives where we ever truly get to relax.
I've
So
never encountered a time where someone telling us to relax suddenly makes everything better either.
exactly, exactly. So,
Mm.
usually it's like when you're in an argument and someone tells you to calm down, the opposite thing
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Now we're calm. Thanks. Yeah.
So in my case, having an injury, right, related to this arm, and then being told to relax, it actually takes me to my trauma, right?
Yeah.
And here I'm talking about a physical trauma, not a psychological trauma or a trauma related to gender-based violence. But it actually physically makes me more tense, physically makes me thinking about that more, taking me to my worry or my pain if I have any
Yeah.
pain. And so that kind of thing can happen in many mundane and very subtle ways that are not, explicit acts of harm or violence.
Yeah.
But it's a lack of understanding about, okay, where am I coming from? What is my experience? And what is your experience? And how does that experience differ based on where we're coming from in life and then how we're meeting in the day?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I want to come back to trauma. I think you've mentioned some really interesting points on there, so we will circle back to that. But taking those risk factors into the dance space is very interesting. You just got me thinking there with the shoulder injury and someone telling you to relax. Where is their just relax coming from? So in those situations, I typically see it coming from a place of entitlement, really, because the person wants who's saying that typically is in it for them. They want you to relax so that this move will work better for us, but for them. Like for us as a pair, but for them as the main thing. They're not considering perhaps there's a reason this other person is not relaxed. Perhaps I don't know everything about them and I shouldn't be trying to dictate what they should or shouldn't be feeling right now. Is
Yeah,
that
and
making sense?
it does make sense. And I think for me, what this comes to is really the heart of feminism, which is gender equality.
Mm,
And in the context of the dance, we are a pair of people, and one person is inviting another person to engage in activity. And if you think of it as an invitation, right? If I invite you to a party at my house, you're not obligated to come to the
yeah.
party. You don't have to come. You can decline or you can not respond. There are many things that you could do. And so it's the same with the dance. So I think that it's that mentality that we need to get into. And I think that particularly when people are beginning to learn, and I still consider myself a beginner really in terms of salsa, it's a lifelong journey.
Mm,
But as a part of that learning journey, that it's not about completing the move. It's not about
yes.
finishing the pattern. It's about, can I express this invitation? Can I offer you this invitation in a way that is clear and, communicative and welcoming? And
Yeah.
then do you choose to accept and take that invitation and interpret it and do with it what you will? And we're both equal in that. We have to be
Yes.
equal for it to succeed and for us to truly be connected. Otherwise, I might as well be dancing by myself.
Well, yeah, otherwise it's not a conversation.
Right.
Indeed. So when we take these risk factors and we bring them into the dance scene, these factors increase. How do you see them increasing in the dance scene compared to our everyday life of the workplace or our board
Well,
games club?
I mean, I think there it's actually a perfect example, which is why do we think of the dance space as any different than our workspace or our learning spaces, right?
Mm,
Because if we think about children who are in school, or even children who are in competitive sports like gymnastics, and of course, there have been sexual violence, notorious sexual violence abuses within
yeah.
gymnastics and within football. I'm talking American football here, um, and other sports. But if we think about those kinds of dynamics and those kinds of workplaces and environments, we have certain expectations of behavior, particularly between teachers and students, if it's a learning environment, or between supervisors and employees, if it's a work
Hmm.
environment. And so, in the context of dance, because this is supposed to be a hobby, right, or a leisure activity, sometimes we don't apply those same standards,
Yeah.
right? And we also think, well, we're all adults here as well, for the most part.
Yeah. 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 This
There,
is
of
almost like
course,
a cop out. I hear people say, we're all adults, so therefore it's fine. I think, well, that doesn't hold in any social situation I've ever been in, but
we're
okay.
all adults operating in society, and there's still rules and norms in society
Everywhere.
everywhere. Exactly.
Yeah.
So the question I like to think about when I am in a learning environment, and to be clear, right, dance is both of these things. It is a learning environment when you're taking classes or workshops or going to congresses. It is a teaching environment for people who are professionals. They are teachers. It's also a professional or a semi-professional workplace for people that are performing. And
Mm-hmm.
then we bring the social dancing on top of it. And that's where it gets murky, right? That's where it gets really muddy because, like,
Yeah.
this is supposed to be the fun part. But if we think about any other school environment, any other learning environment, any other workplace environment, if we see something happening in a dance environment and we ask ourselves, would that happen? Or what would happen if this was a school, a university, a workplace? Would
Yeah.
that behavior be acceptable? And I think that that's a really important question that we have to ask ourselves because often we just say, but this is different. It's a hobby. It's a after work hours kind of
Yeah.
activity. And so we shouldn't have those sort of standards of behavior or expectations. And I think
Yeah.
we really have to question ourselves about that.
Yeah, that for me is exactly where the risk factors shoot through the roof because we have this accepted standard, which is like down there on the floor, that, we don't need to govern what people are doing. We don't need to have a standard of care. We don't have a duty of care. I mean, we have mostly an unregulated scene in terms of who's doing what role, and we have physical touch being taught within that space. I mean, that really amplifies the risk factors in my point of view and experience. Um, it just makes total sense what you're saying. Why wouldn't we treat that like any other place that we function in?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we have to have conversations and there's some intersections here, and I think that this again takes me back to my experience of capoeira,
Hmm.
where coming from this really system of oppression, right, where people were enslaved,
Yeah.
and sometimes what happens is that we replicate those systems of oppression. And so I think this is my personal opinion, a little bit aside from my experience in gender-based violence, but we see systems of oppression replicating themselves over and over, and their intersections with capitalism. And
Hmm.
so, for example, as salsa and as Latin dance has become more commercialized, I think, in fact, what we're doing is we're actually drawing upon some of those deeply embedded roots within those systems of oppression and hierarchy that are related to race, that are related to gender identity, that are related to finances, right? And we're doing that subconsciously because it's a sea that we are used to swimming in, unfortunately. And
Yeah.
so really questioning ourselves and thinking about, would this be acceptable in any other context or environment? What are we doing about consent, right? Even it can be the simplest thing, right? Can I touch you, right?
Yeah.
Can I touch you here? Is this okay? Those aren't hard questions to ask. Those are quite simple questions, actually.
Yeah.
I have a son who's now he's 12. Um, but when he was much younger, we had this experience, and he identifies as a boy. And he sort of touched me in some way, nothing inappropriate really, but it was kind of a little bit more physical than I would have wanted it to be.
Hmm.
And I said, we have to ask to touch other people. We have to ask if it's okay. Can I touch you? And he was
Hmm.
probably 5 at the time. And it's
Yeah.
like, this is something that a 5-year-old can understand.
Yeah.
This is something that adult people in community together should be able to do.
Yeah. Oh, completely. I have a very similar example from teaching preschool where one of my little kitty winks, I think he put his hands on my boobs. I think that was it. And so one of the other teachers jumped in to say, "No, we don't. No, we don't," kind of thing. So instead, I said to the child, "People don't like it when you touch their boobs. It's, I know you've touched mummy's boobs. That's mummy. She's different. But with other people, we don't touch their boobs. People don't like it. So it's not a good idea." And he's kind of like, okay. Just taking it on board, as you say, it's not like an untalkable thing. And this was a 3-year-old, and he was quite happy to understand and okay, you know?
And it's as much about, really that's about communication
Yeah.
because consent is not about saying no necessarily, right? I could just as equally say, yes, that's okay, that's fine. But it's also about, in the case of a child, right? It's also about teaching that person that they get to decide who touches their body. So
Yes.
that's extremely important as we think about how do we protect children. And I think, for those of us that are adults, we didn't necessarily have that education.
Mm-hmm.
All of us have the auntie who we love, but who just grabbed you up and snatched you up and kissed you on the cheek and gave no consideration for consent.
Yeah.
Like, well, no. Okay, so as a child, the message you're receiving is it's okay for adults to snatch you up and give you kisses, even if you don't want them.
Yeah.
And so we've all sort of, accepted that kind of learning. And then when we become adults Why are we surprised that some people think that they can do some behaviors without asking? So
Yeah.
we have to re-educate ourselves, also to teach ourselves. I get to choose when someone touches me, if someone touches me, how they touch me in the
Mhm.
context of dance and in the context of my life. And
Yeah.
everyone should have that bodily autonomy.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we see that you named it as systems of oppression, sorry, which was a really succinct way to put it. And we see that in many ways when, myself included, when I started bachata and I wasn't too sure about some movements. And you kind of look around going, okay, well, this is what's done. Maybe I'm a bit prudy. Maybe I'm not cut
Mhm.
out for this, or I just got to get with the program and get used to this kind of physical closeness or this kind of touch without any part of the system, being that my classmates, teachers, people around me saying, hey, you don't actually have to be touched in this way when you are dancing. You can dance and still maintain the boundaries you want to maintain. And on the flip side, with that coin as well that you mentioned, because it is two sides of a coin, I see the way some teachers treat their, mostly women, with a more prop type attitude and this more kind of, I'm the peacock, look at me. And it's no shock to me then that the students who come through that system tend to be, the ones who are drawn to it also appeal in some way to that attitude. And then they start perpetuating that attitude. And then those of us who are thinking we've got to get with the program and it's just meeting in a terrible middle.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that happens when we come together in groups or communities is groupthink, right? That's a
Hmm.
real thing that can happen where everyone starts to think and act the same. And
Yes.
so when you come in as a beginner, some things can be very shocking to you. Like,
Hmm.
I remember my first Congress that I went to, I was like, what is the deal with these bodysuits? Like, why is everyone wearing these bodysuits? Like, I was just like, this is so impractical, like, and now I own a few bodysuits and I do understand their appeal and they have their time and place if you want to use them. But one of the things that happens is when we're an outsider or new
Hmm.
to a community, those things may really strike us.
Yeah.
And then because we want to be accepted into the community and because we're also learning, we begin to adopt some of those behaviors.
Yeah.
And that's all well and good if they are behaviors that are healthy and helpful and community building and technique building and,
And safe.
happiness building and safe. Um,
Yeah.
but it's the opposite when those behaviors are harmful. So the few examples that you gave, and we see this even in very mundane things, like, for example, certain moves being performed, right?
Mm.
So in salsa, multiple spins. Not
Yeah.
everybody likes multiple spins. Spinning is like dancing. It's going to be a work in progress for forever. Um, but I'm never going to do 7 spins. I'm never
Yeah.
going to want to do that. It's not going to be enjoyable to me. And so being mindful of that and just sort of, myself thinking about how comfortable do I feel doing this move? Okay, I can do a double now. And sometimes I can do it, and sometimes I'm a little more wobbly. And what do
Yeah.
I need to work on in my technique? But also, where is my boundary around that? And, okay, what's the worst thing that happens? I fall out of the spin and the move doesn't get completed, but then I just wasn't ready for it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And having your partner listen to that. And it may not be a verbal communication, but to have them listen, because we're dancing, most of it's nonverbal. So that physical active listening to see when you are exhibiting positive or negative feelings or reactions to things, and then, picking up on that. And that's you setting a boundary and that's them hearing it and respecting it. And that's what should be happening out there.
And I think that also goes back to the part of our conversation talking about tension and relaxing.
Oh,
So
yeah.
this is where the leaders have the opportunity to actually read their partners.
Yeah.
So, we talked about that the leader is extending an invitation, but the leader is also receiving information. They're receiving information about my tension level. And
Hmm.
if they're trying to do something and I'm not comfortable and they can feel it in my response, then there's an opportunity for them to say, hey, maybe I need to take it down a notch,
Yeah.
right? Because the really advanced dancers, they adjust their level. They're not going to do the same thing with everybody. And
No.
that's understandably, that is a really advanced skill. But I think it's an opportunity for people to practice because we all dance with people of different levels every single time we go out.
Yeah.
And so, how can I adjust myself to my partner? That should be a constant process that's always happening. And taking tension as a sign that, okay, maybe I need to be a little bit more, basic, but like the
Or
basic is everything. So
no,
let's
but it
do the
could just be,
basic.
changing up the moves or changing the style of move or going back to the basics, starting to build again, as you say, and then you find the point where your follower is comfortable and you're like, right, here's our touch point. We're going to go from foundations up to this point and we're going to play in here.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And that's great
And
to do.
I mentioned the basic because the word basic, not the basic, but the word basic has sort of taken on a negative connotation in recent years.
Yeah,
And actually, I think as a dancer, what I have learned and continue to learn is like the basic is everything.
it is.
The basic is everything. So if all I do in a dance is the basic with my partner, how can I do that to the best of my ability to be the most expressive, the most connected within that 3-minute song?
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. And I mean, I've also found sometimes where before I got to the point of what you're describing now of being, okay, no, I can really have fun with this. I would use my basic if I had a leader who was in the more foundation stages as very basic. I was like, great, okay, here's 5 minutes practice, let's go.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
it's we all need to practice our basics. How often do we go to the beginner improver lessons once you've spent some time in the intermediate ones? Not
Exactly.
enough, I'd say.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah, use those dips into the basics and foundations to tune up. Have
exactly.
fun.
We're,
Yes.
it's a process and we're all learning. And if you're not learning, then we're missing part of the process.
Okay, so I know we said we were going to move into trauma, but actually trauma is now going to be our part two, if that's okay with you, Dabney.
Of course. There is one other thing that I wanted to say about gender-based violence, and that
Oh,
is
please do.
how common it is. And so if we think about intimate partner violence specifically, again, which just being one form of gender-based violence,
Hmm.
about 1 in 3 women globally will experience some form of physical, psychological, or sexual violence in their lives. And it's about 1 in 4 men. That data is specifically for the US, but I think that we can, sort of imagine that the big takeaway here is that these are extremely common experiences.
Yeah.
1 in 3 women in their lifetimes, 1 in 4 men. And so, if we think about that, if that was any other disease or health condition, it would be
We'd
an
be
epidemic,
we'd
right?
be on that.
Yeah. And so, these behaviors are also transmissible. That's part of what we're talking about. They're sort of
Yeah.
infectious, right?
Yes.
And so we really need to recognize, and maybe this is a good segue into the trauma bit. Okay, how are we going to deal with this? Because if 1 in every 3 people that you encounter, or 1 in every 4 people that you encounter, has some experience of gender-based violence or trauma, then that's a lot of people that you're coming in contact with. So, how can we be more mindful and think about that within our day-to-day interactions?
That's a huge point to sit and think about.
How many
That's
dances do you have in a given night, right? A
yes.
third or a quarter of those people are likely, if you have 10 dances, if you have 30 dances, then you're coming in contact with people that have these kinds of experiences for
Yeah.
sure.
Dabney, I know we haven't moved into trauma like I suggested we would, but this has been such an insightful conversation to learn with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I think that as a dancer and as an academic that studies gender-based violence, It's it's not surprising to me that these worlds intersect,
Hmm.
and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be here with you to bring what knowledge I have about gender-based violence to the dance space. It's a community that I love and care for, and I'm still a learner, just like everyone else. And so I hope that that the listeners find this helpful.
Thank you. As a community, we don't spend enough time considering the very real gender-based violence that is present in our scene. and it interweaves so much throughout the community, just as we've been meandering a bit in our conversation here today. Dabney Evans, thank you very much, and I look forward to welcoming you back soon to talk about trauma and ways that we can move forward as a community. You are a treasure trove of knowledge with your experience in the dance and martial arts space, and as you say, intersecting with your academic professional area as well. So I'm really excited to welcome you back very soon so that we can move into the next phase of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Bobby.